You're listening to NeoTalk, the official podcast of the Faculty of Modern Languages at the University of Warsaw. My name is Maria Usakowska. William Shakespeare died over 400 years ago, yet his works are still being performed and written about extensively, to the point that it seems that there's little mystery left in them. Don't we already know everything that there is to know about Shakespeare? This episode's guest, actor and theater producer Ben Crystal, takes us on a journey back in time to the Elizabethan era. Ben is an author, creative producer, and explorer of original practices in Shakespeare rehearsal and production. He's an associate artist at the Shakespeare North Playhouse and a patron of Shakespeare Week. With his father, David Crystal, he co-authored 4 books on language in Shakespeare's world. His first solo book, Shakespeare on Toast, Getting a Taste for the Bard, from 2008, was shortlisted for the 2010 Educational Writer of the Year Award. In December 2023, he was invited to give a talk on original pronunciation during the second Humanities Society Identity International Congress, which is when we recorded this episode. In this conversation, Ben talks about his personal journey with Shakespeare, his unconventional methods of producing a play, and what can still be discovered in the works of England's national poet. Please enjoy my conversation with Ben Crystal. Ben Crystal, welcome to NeoTalk. So good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And I want to start with a very big question. Why do we still read and perform Shakespeare today?
Oh, wow, you're going to start with an easy one. Gosh, well, I suppose, at least in the UK, because it's on the syllabus, because we're told that we should. And I really struggled with that when I was in school. I really didn't find my way to Shakespeare whilst it was on the page. It took until I acted it for the first time that it really made sense to me. And it's been, 25 years, I suppose now, of working with Shakespeare almost every day in some way or other, or at least engaging with Shakespeare in some way or other every day. And the new book that I've co-written with my father called Everyday Shakespeare, Lines for Life, has a different page for every day of the year and a different quote from Shakespeare for every day. But rather than pick the really famous quotes that lots of people have heard, like "to be or not to be, that is the question," or "is this a dagger I see before me," or a horse, my kingdom for a horse," I think, a lot of people leave school with these ideas of Shakespeare and these really famous lines. But what I discovered writing this new book is that there are so many lines that you probably would never have noticed, like "make not your thoughts your prisons," or "grief makes 1 hour 10," or "better 3 hours too soon than a minute too late." There are these lines in Shakespeare that no matter who you are or where you're from, there's a very good chance that you know something of what it feels like to want to say those words. You've loved in that way, or you've grieved in that way, or you felt jealous in that way, or you've lost something in that way. And even having worked with him for so long, it wasn't until I wrote this new book that I realized the depth and breadth of his examination into the human condition, not just kings struggling to keep their crown and turning over what it is to be a leader, or incredibly powerful young women taking their life in their hands and deciding to forge their own path. He does look at all of these things too, but in the corners, in the sort of hidden depths of these works, of these plays and these poems, are these incredible jewels of insights that really give an incredible perspective on what it is to be a living, breathing, feeling, emotional creature on this rock for a cosmic eye blink. And especially after the last few years, with all of the grief and the isolation that the world experienced through the pandemic, I think it's more important than ever that we learn empathy and practice compassion and kindness toward each other, and that we deal with the traumas that we experience rather than cope with them. and put a pin in them and just sort of carry on, wondering why we're getting tireder and why things are getting harder all the time. And Shakespeare, having written all these characters and all these ideas and all these thoughts and all these feelings, has become, in some ways, I see it, the collection of these works as like a sandbox, a really safe place to take our next generations, our children, our younglings, and give them an opportunity to play at being a king or a queen or a prince or a princess or a fairy or a witch or whatever, and have fights and swear at each other and all that fun stuff. But then they can also practice talking about love and talking about grief and talking about loss. And it's not their experiences, it's not their words, but perhaps it can ready them for when they do experience those things. Now, none of this was made clear to me when I was in school, when I was being asked to stand up behind a desk and read out loud a speech from Macbeth, or when I was being asked to write an essay or an exam question on these things. None of this really became clear. And then in the years since, one of the questions that often comes up is, is Shakespeare still relevant? Why are we still working and studying and watching these plays? And yeah, it's only really been in the last couple of years that's clarified or crystallized into a clear answer for me. And that is, there's so much we can learn and teach each other about how to navigate this world emotionally and psychologically and healthily.
I hope this is not too personal, but as you mentioned, you were not a big fan of Shakespeare in school. But as far as I know, now you have a quote of him tattooed on your arm. So I think there's been a journey there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So on my left arm, I have the words "Nothing will come of nothing" tattooed so that I can read it. The first word is written in my father's handwriting. The next three words beneath them are written in my grand's handwriting. And then the last word beneath that, the last nothing, is in my mother's handwriting. So I've always got my family with me. My elders with me, my living elders. And the "Nothing will come of nothing" is a line from King Lear, which is, so I studied Macbeth when I was 15, 16. And when I was 17, 18, we studied King Lear. And I hated that play. Oh my God, if I thought I hated Macbeth, I really struggled studying King Lear. Because, we really did that whole, I can't even remember how long it was, but it was at least 3 weeks and probably a lot more. Every lesson just slogging through scene by scene, act by act. And then I think we got taken to see it, but it was a school trip. So, of course, we all go out the night before and we're all hungover and falling asleep during what turned out to be one of the greatest productions of King Lear of the late 20th century as well, which I have a lot of memories of, but also there was a few black moments I don't remember. I just wasn't into it. And then, like I say, I acted it. I acted Ariel in The Tempest, and it changed my life. And gosh, it must have been about 10 years later, I was invited to play Edgar in King Lear. And Edgar is the young nobleman whose half-brother Edmund convinces everyone that I, Edgar, have been plotting our father's death. And Edmund convinces Edgar to run away. And everyone is now chasing after Edgar because everyone thinks he's guilty because he's run away. And he disguises himself as a beggarman and a completely mad beggarman that believes he's being hunted by the devil, and eventually encounters the maddened King Lear, and then later on encounters his father, who's now had his eyes torn out because he was loyal to the old king. And he guides his father, not being truthful about who he is. He's still pretending not to be Edgar, not to be himself. And then saves his father's life in a fight. He challenges his half-brother to a duel at the end, and they have a massive sword fight and wins. And it becomes king, essentially. And in the passing of that last final bit, we hear that his father also died, but in the final moments, he told him who he really was, and they made up, It's a beautiful arc to go from that sort of geeky student to madman to, young warrior king. It's a really lovely arc. And we went to rehearse this and perform this in a very small village up in the mountains in Austria. And every morning we would climb up this hill and go into this castle and rehearse the play. We had about 6 days, I think, to rehearse the whole thing. And now normally in professional productions of Shakespeare, you'd get maybe 10 weeks. And we performed it for 4 or 5 days too. So the whole experience didn't last more than 10 days. And during it, there's a scene when Edgar, his father, blinded, decides he wants to kill himself and says, take me to a cliff edge. And Edgar, still pretending not to be Edgar, not to be himself, says, okay, I'll take you there. But he takes him to a flat place and pretends that they're at the cliff top. And his hope is that his father, having tried to kill himself, the depression, as it were, will pass and he'll find a new zest for life. And as we rehearsed it, we were being guided by the director, and he said, take his hand. And I took his hand, like the guy playing my father, and led him to the edge of the rabbit ears cliff, it wasn't a cliff edge, but to where I was pretending the cliff edge was. And the director said, now let go of his hand and say goodbye. And I started crying. I was in control of my emotions, but something in that moment unlocked. There's an actor that I work with that talks about when you're doing Shakespeare right, and there's no right way to do it, but when it's working well, when you're not trying too hard with it, it's like standing under the waterfall. And the words, the feelings, those characters, they live and thrive through you. I'd never experienced anything like it before. I'd always loved acting, but we finished the scene, I was still crying. We went through the scene again, I was still crying. I was just completely emotionally connected. It was the second transcendental experience of acting Shakespeare in 10 years. The first being the very first time I did it, and I realized that these are called plays and they're not called reads, and they really, really work when they have an audience watching them and actors have learnt the words off by heart. That was revelatory to me. And this experience, acting in this play that I hated, the connection with the cast in making this thing so quickly and it going so well, changed my life. And so the tattoo is there. So I have my elders with me. It's there to remind me, exactly as you say, that you can grow up hating peas or broccoli and end up loving it, that your tastes change, that experiences or opinions are not indelibly marked on your soul, and that you can listen and reconsider and allow new experiences to change you, and indeed that they can change you so profoundly. And since people have said that part of this nothing will come of nothing is like, the reference to the Big Bang as well. There's people that will interpret it differently. And I haven't actually got yet a second tattoo. I want to get one on my other arm to kind of balance it, because fundamentally as a self-employed creative actor, author, creative producer, work in schools with a therapy dog with students that are neurodiverse. I give workshops, I direct. I try to do everything to keep working as an artist, I suppose, because it was already hard before the pandemic, but my goodness, it's talking with all my creative colleagues, it's just gotten so much harder since. And nothing will come of nothing. If you don't get out of bed in the morning and come up with this idea to produce a play or apply for that audition or whatever, then don't be surprised if nothing will happen. So like the book title, it's a real line that struck so much with me. I wanted it with me for life. Because it's an active thing, nothing will come of nothing, get up out of bed and do stuff. I've got to come up with an idea for something that will allow me to, sitting still is also very good.
Something about resting, maybe.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Also, I like the idea of Shakespeare writing motivational quotes, Mm-hmm. It's something that we would consider probably very contemporary, but maybe apparently it's not.
Yeah, I was really surprised by... we intentionally did this, but there were so many lines that we picked. It was part of the point, really, that you could read it and think that could have just been written yesterday. It sounds so informal, it sounds so natural, it sounds slightly poetic maybe, or exceptionally well put. It sounds eloquent, but it doesn't sound old. And indeed, we as people haven't changed that much. We've gotten a bit taller. We still have the same sort of hearts beating inside of us. We still have the same sort of troubles. So yeah, there is a lot of wisdom in there, and there's a lot of caution in there, and a lot of kind of, hey, we're also pretty horrible to each other, and we should be mindful and careful and do better and enjoy life more. Live a little, love a little, comfort thyself a little is one of his, the kind of things you could see on a T-shirt, I suppose, or, one of those, like you say, a motivational ball or something, or mug. But grab every scrap of happiness while you can, as Noel Coward said.
I, of course, don't want to diminish the weight of his words. Just because something, when we say it out loud, sounds a little bit banal, doesn't mean that it's not true or that is not important.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's also some really bad bits of Shakespeare.
Can you give me an example?
I mean...
Is there a play that you particularly still don't like?
I mean, I've always had a lot of trouble with Merry Wives of Windsor. It's one of the plays, if possibly the only play that Shakespeare wrote the plot of. Lots of the other plays are famous stories that have been told before, or histories or whatever. It's said to have been requested by Queen Elizabeth I because she enjoyed the character of Falstaff so much in the Henry IV plays. And it's a silly romp where a drunken man wants to have an affair with two separate wives. And the two wives decide they're going to outsmart him and make a fool of him, whilst the husbands are running around trying to, not be cuckolded, essentially. And one of the families has a daughter, and there are 5 different suitors for the daughter, and they are all competing with each other. And it ends with the Queen of the Fairies, I think.
It sounds like Jane Austen on steroids.
Yeah, that's a really good description, actually. Yeah, actually, that's not far off. Very good. Yeah, and it's just not his finest hour in writing. There are some good bits in it. Love's Labour's Lost, similarly. All's Well That Ends Well is a very difficult and complicated play. And, these are just the ones that we have. We've got about 36, maybe depending on how you count them, 36 to 39 plays by Shakespeare. There are probably a lot more that we lost. That when Shakespeare died in 1616, it wasn't until 2 or 3 years later that his actors realized that a lot of the plays didn't exist, essentially. It had been 20 years or more since they'd performed Romeo and Juliet. And because of the way they worked together, in that if you're playing Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet, and halfway through the play you die, then when you come to rehearse, you're not going to copy out the second half of the play because paper is expensive and you don't have very much time. They would have had about 2 or 3 hours every morning for a few mornings to rehearse a new play. They would have just rehearsed the dances and the fights, the complicated bits, and they would have improvised their movement together. They would have played together. So they don't have much rehearsal time, and paper is expensive, so they copy out only the scenes that they're in. It's a bit like a modern orchestra. The bassist only has the bass notes, and the cellist only has the cello's notes, and the violinist only has the violin notes. And why would the tuba carry around the harpist notes? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So Mercutio just copies out, the actor playing Mercutio just copies out the lines that they're going to say, the cue words of when to say them, and the cue words of when to exit and enter. And after Shakespeare died, and they were trying to gather all the plays together to publish them, they realized that some of the plays only existed in these separate parts. So they had to go round all of the different actors and say, do you still have your words for Romeo and Juliet or As You Like It or whatever? And then they had to put them back together again like a jigsaw puzzle. They didn't have existing copies. And some of the speeches, they were only being carried in their heads and they had to remember them. So that's why some of the editions of Shakespeare, you often see in a modern edition, there's all these kind of notes beneath the words. That's why a lot of them are there. They're not just to explain the difficult words or what words, how the meanings have changed or that kind of thing, or draw some beautiful analogy. It's there because there's some of the texts are a bit jagged, let's say. And All's Well That Ends Well is jagged and has a very complicated plot that it's hard for the audience to buy into. A woman is in love with and wants to marry someone that really doesn't like her and is quite clear about it, and it doesn't treat her well, and she tricks him into consummating their marriage, so they have to be together. It's really hard to support her in her desires because we're like, no, he's an idiot, why would you want to be with him? But she's in love with him. Anyway, it's not a good play.
Is there a chance that it's not a good play because we don't have the whole text, for example?
I think that might be true, that's the best version of it that they managed to put back together. Or, Shakespeare were having a bad day. And they gathered all the plays that they could gather, and they didn't necessarily gather all of, they gathered them all, but they didn't put a quality control on that necessarily. I mean, Troilus and Cressida is a pretty epic play, but it's not a good piece of drama. It sort of fizzles out. And some say the same about Julius Caesar. The first half is fantastic, and then the second half there's kind of just battles and then sort of stops. Antony and Cleopatra, the same. Shakespeare was not perfect in any way. He was a really, really great writer of these lines that make you go, pow, I feel seen. And occasionally, quite often, like King Lear, he can write a cracking play. Sometimes maybe he needed to draft it again, maybe we got an old draft rather than the final draft, I don't know. But I think it's really important, as much as I'm holding this author or the works of this author up to the light and saying these are wonderful things that are really worthwhile spending time with, they are absolutely flawed and sometimes can be tricky to enjoy. So I don't think I will... Oh, that's really hard. I was about to say I don't think I will ever direct a production of All's Well That Ends Well. I'm not interested in it, but who knows?
Who knows?
Maybe nothing will come of nothing, right? Maybe my opinion will change.
I want to ask you about your Passion and Practice production company, because the methodology of staging the plays were, we could say, a little bit unconventional. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. After that experience in Austria, raising this epic, huge tragedy, and very, in terms of the dramaturgically, what we have to do, make the fights and everything else. Making King Lear in 10 days. Not just making it, but making it and performing it, start to finish, in less than 2 weeks. That blew my mind. I was so fascinated. And my Shakespeare teacher in drama school had a company called the Original Shakespeare Company, and they would practice the craft of rehearsing a Shakespeare play just like Shakespeare's actors, or as close as we could possibly get. And so the routine of Shakespeare's actors would have been something like this. They'd go to the theatre in the morning, they'd rehearse the dances and the fights for the play that they're going to perform that afternoon. Then they would have had a bit of free time. I'll come back to the free time. Then they would perform the play at 2:00 in the afternoon, because it's a theatre without a roof. They perform by sunlight or the light of the day. The play would finish about somewhere between 4 and 5 o'clock, between the second and third tolling of the Southwark Cathedral bell. The 2 hours traffic of the stage, as they say in Romeo and Juliet. Then, I don't know, they would either go home to their families, they would go to the tavern, some things don't change. They would get the lines for the next play. Then they come back the next day and do a different play. Every day, a different play. 6 days a week, every week. They were said to have, someone's worked out, they had about 40 plays in their head at any one time. 40.
When did they have the time to learn all this text?
Right? Absolutely. And also, sort of just the flip side of that, in the mornings they have a little bit of spare time. What are you going to do with that time? It's really valuable. And so, coming back to the scripts, of course you're not going to copy out parts of the play that you're not in. Now, you recognize now, there is no time for that. What parts of a new play are you going to rehearse? Or what about if the play that you're performing this afternoon, you haven't performed it for 3 months? Which bits do you need to or want to refresh? And which bits do you think, I can wing this, I can just improvise? I know you, Maria, we've been working together for, by the time they did Macbeth, 15 years together. So I can guess you're going to be capable, you're going to take care of your stuff. When we're in this sort of scene where there's this kind of dialogue, we know how we're going to play with each other. I know the sorts of pratfalls and jokes you'll make, the sort of thing I do. So they're only going to rehearse the bits that either need to be really, really pretty or are really complicated or dangerous. So the fights and the dances and that sort of thing. They would have had, they think, about 18 hours to rehearse a new play over the course of maybe 2 or 3 weeks. That's something like 3 days of 10 a.m. till 6 p.m. of full rehearsals. So Patrick, my teacher at drama school, his Original Shakespeare Company, they had a different model. Each actor would meet the director, as it were, and the master of the play, they call it. And they would have 3 one-on-one sessions where they go through their cue script, with just their lines. Someone would read the cue, so they'd get used to responding to the cue that they hear. The actors wouldn't meet each other. They would get 3 of these sessions, but they wouldn't meet each other until the day of the play. They rehearsed the dances and the fights in the morning for the first time together, and in the afternoon, They perform the play for the first time, having no idea who is playing what. The first time I saw this, we actually experienced a sort of our own version of this in drama school too, and I loved it. And I went to see them perform, I think it was a play called Cymbeline, a Shakespeare play called Cymbeline. And it didn't always go well. You know, sometimes actors didn't realize they were supposed to be kneeling, and someone says to them, "Why do you kneel before me?" or that sort of thing. You know, there were a few times it didn't go as you'd hope, but a lot of the time it worked. And I suddenly became really fascinated. The skill sets and the craft that they needed to avoid those kind of mistakes. Also, they would have had to listen really, really carefully to the text, to each other, to the situation. If you come in and someone's wearing a crown, you're probably going to kneel before him. Or if you're feeling guilty, you know, if you follow the emotions of it, the text or the situation or the theatre will guide you in some way. So if you've got a group of people that have played together an awful lot, that really know how each other play really well, that know the performance space that they're playing in, they know how to work that, how to improvise their stagecraft, their blocking, their movement during the play, that they have a solid relationship with the audience and a really, really careful and particular and specific understanding of how to interpret, how to look for the clues that Shakespeare put in his text to sort of guide and direct actors. And then, like you say, a really strong and muscular memory. And that's what we've been exploring. We started making Shakespeare plays like King Lear. Shortly after King Lear, I started making them in about 2 weeks, then a week, then 5 days, then 3 days. And in 2019, this was with a different company that I founded called the Shakespeare Ensemble. We went to Japan and we made 3 productions of Shakespeare in 1 week. We had 3 days to make Macbeth. We had 2 days to make Romeo and Juliet. And then we made Hamlet in 1 day.
Well, that's crazy, but
Yes.
did you learn the text before you even started, or I mean, I also imagine you know parts of it, right, by heart.
It really helps that these
helps.
are quite familiar plays.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. I imagine most people who have had some degree of Shakespeare in their lives could probably rattle out a line like "Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo?" or "Is this a dagger I see before me?" from Macbeth, or "To be or not to be" from Hamlet. These are quite well-known pieces, it's true. That's part of the reason why we chose them. I laugh because you have the best intentions, you know, to learn the lines as early as possible, and life gets in the way, and I was producing the tour as well. The other things kept taking my attention, and it's the same happened to the other actors. And there were bits that were definitely learned, but there's also... So I've been giving myself less and less time to learn these lines, learn these parts, for the same reason that you asked, you know, how did they do it? How did their memories work? And the only way you can really find out the answer to that question is by putting yourself into a situation where you don't have much time to learn them, and it's either learn them or you're going to look really stupid on stage in front of a live audience. So I gave myself 2 weeks to learn Macbeth. I gave myself, a week for Pericles. And I only had a few days, I think, to learn Henry V. But the memory is like a muscle. If you can do push-ups or pull-ups, but you can only do 1, well, if you keep working at it, you'll be able to do 2 soon enough, and eventually 10, and eventually 20. And the memory is the same. It's about understanding, in some respects, how the short-term memory works in relation to the long-term memory for me. So I laughed earlier because when we raised Hamlet in a day, I was learning my cue scripts on the train from an island in the south of Japan to Tokyo, which took us about 6 hours. Then we got to the theatre and we had half an hour, I think, in the space before the audience came in to do the dances and to do the fights, to work out how we were going to do the fights in that space. And then, so my laughter was, I was playing Claudius, who's Hamlet's uncle, who murdered his father, spoiler. And there's a sequence in the latter half of the play where Claudius comes on and has a little scene and comes off, and then there's another scene, and then he comes on again and has a little scene and comes off again. And my colleague told me this quite recently. He saw me coming off stage and learning the lines for the next scene and then going on and doing them, just grabbing them up into my short-term memory and churning them out again. It's been a really exciting way to explore Shakespeare. All of this I don't mean winging it at all, but all of this exploration in really pushing the envelope of the experiment and seeing how this would have worked under tremendous pressure and how they would have worked under tremendous pressure and the sort of shorthands and shortcuts they would come up with that limited time has turned our rehearsal process into the most wonderful, playful, safe space where we really just spend an awful lot of time playing physically with each other. Usually it's physical, but without necessarily touching each other, as it were. And that's partly because I think a lot of Shakespeare productions, a lot of modern Shakespeare productions we are a very tactile people generally in this modern world, at least in a lot of societies. There's a lot of hugging, there's a lot of hand clasping and touching shoulders and that sort of thing. And goodness knows around Europe, there's lots of kissings of hellos and goodbyes and that. And if you take a king or a queen, for example, and you hug them hello or you touch them in some way, they immediately lose their power. So we get into the habit of playing together with bamboo sticks between our fingertips with each other, which forces into our muscle memory a particular distance that works exceptionally well on a big stage, so that when we're improvising our movement in the heat of the adrenaline and will I remember my lines and everything else, we're managing to keep from collapsing into the modern, exclusive, physically close intimacy because we are nervous and we want it to be meaningful. So we will come together and be right up against each other's faces. But that completely excludes the audience. So we rehearse these physical games so we get to learn how each other play. We get to drill into our muscle memory a good dance distance, as it were. This is my dance space, this is your dance space sort of thing. And then, as I gave the talk yesterday here at the university on the accent of Shakespeare's time, which can bring a more emotionally connected reading or speaking and learning, indeed, of the lines. And so what we found, with or without the accent actually, but in making these shows in this way, in this very sort of ensemble rehearsal process and leaving the words often until very late to speak to each other, or indeed sometimes just for the first time on stage in front of the audience, that the production is very visceral, it's very fast, it's very passionate and emotionally driven. And because we try and stick to that idea from Romeo and Juliet, the 2 hours traffic, it's often maybe 90 minutes or maybe a little bit longer, but not that much longer to keep the audience comfortable. And audiences say that they leave feeling emotionally drained and exhausted in the most exhilarating way. And I've got so many memories of going to see Shakespeare and it lasts 3.5 hours. And I'm actually, even though I love the play, I'm often bored because I'm watching actors that have spent weeks rehearsing and their movements are choreographed. And they're probably like emotionally engaged in it, but it's the 60th time they've done it. These plays were never written to be performed that much by the same people. Even if a play was really, really popular in Shakespeare's time, it might have been performed, 4 or 5 times over the course of the year. So it's been interesting to look back as much as we can gauge of how they used to do it, fill in the gaps with modern choreographic or dance techniques, and make some hopeful guesses about how to do some stuff, and then create, because we usually wear like just rehearsal clothes, modern dress, very few props, and create this experience, I suppose, of that's hopefully entertaining with the our fingers crossed, we make you laugh and make you cry. And we don't often, or at least we didn't used to, explain the process to the audience. We didn't want them to know. We wanted the play to be judged on its own merits and the production to be judged on its own merits. And then afterwards, I would often say, and by the way, we had 3 days together or something like that, so that the audience can then be like, wow, okay, that was good, but also, wow, that's fascinating. Rather than if we tell them beforehand and they've got that filter, then they're sort of looking for mistakes and that sort of thing. But it's really, really fun to do, and we've been told it's fun and engaging to watch. And it's certainly different from the kind of Shakespeare I grew up watching. And the idea is that it's the type of process that Shakespeare was writing his plays for. So this idea, this approach to performing and producing Shakespeare is sort of written into the DNA of the plays. He knew the actors didn't have much time, so he wrote in such a way to help them. And indeed, wrote in a style of poetry that helps the memory too. So I feel a little bit like a sort of dramaturgical forensic archaeologist or something, or that he's even looking for the past to find cures for the future. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do Shakespeare, but it's certainly fun.
I think also what you were putting an emphasis on, as far as I understand, was this closeness between the actors, right? In order to pull that off, what you're talking about, putting together a play in 3 days, you have to know each other very well in order to anticipate the other person and to predict what the other person is going to do. I think that's, in a way, as far as I understand, it's also a little bit different from the standard making of the theater.
Well,
casts
always bond incredibly closely. Showmances happen a lot, right? There's an old saying of a friend was playing Juliet, and she went to meet with the actor playing Romeo, and she said, look, I've done this before. I guess she'd been in the play before, or even played Juliet before, I can't remember. But I know how this goes. We can either fall in love and it go all horribly wrong, or we can become great friends. Let's become great friends. And just sort of said it from the off, because, you play Romeo and Juliet, falling in love is in the DNA of those words, right? So, whether they're showmances or not, and they usually are, even in a traditional rehearsal process, you are watching each other, especially with Shakespeare, run through the mill of some pretty intense human conditioning experiences, character building. Certainly, you're practicing opening yourself up as an empathic creature and allowing space, opening yourself up to be vulnerable, so that the people watching you can not just see you being miserable, but see themselves in you sharing your misery, I suppose. And that's intense. That's always intense. And you can't become best friends with everyone you work with, especially, you work in the profession for 30 or 40 years. You can't take a friend from every production, as it were. But you feel like you want to. They always feel like they're relationships that are going to last forever when you're in the bubble of that show. And 10 weeks is a long time to rehearse something, and then, heaven knows, 6 months, longer in musicals, right, is a long time to play and work together. Shakespeare and his actors spent about 20 years together, 15 by the time they did Macbeth. Think about how well you know someone after studying with them for 6 months, and then how well you know someone who you've worked with for 2 years, or how well you know someone, a friend that you've known for 5 years. Or 10 years. 15 years by the time they did Macbeth. There's no way I will ever get the funding unless some billionaire who loves Shakespeare hears me talking about this one day, to find and pay 15 to 20 actors to spend 5 years together and get something close to how Shakespeare and his company were at the beginning. So how do we short circuit ourselves to that place? And it's just as you say, really. I work to create a really safe space. I use practices of intimacy direction so that the actors know that they can comfortably and safely be physical with each other, and that it is under agreed on boundaries, that at any point someone can stop the action, that no one has to put up with anything that they don't want to. This is a really radical and different and much needed change in the profession that's happened in the last 6-7 years, really. That there are multiple lines of recourse for anyone that experiences anything that they don't like and they're not happy with, instead of just, there being the director or something like that. We don't have a director, but because Shakespeare and his actors didn't have directors, so we let the text direct us. Anyway, we create a very safe space and we play very hard with each other, like to move around each other very quickly, to intuit at speed where someone might move whilst you're, as it were, dancing around them in one of these choreographic games we play. And that often means that when we're on a stage and doing a play and moving relatively slowly, it's really easy to see how someone's going to move, because you've learned how to watch them move quickly and make decisions at high speed. But yeah, all of those, I said earlier, we look back at the past and we can understand a little bit of some of the rehearsal processes and what they did and how they did it. but there's a lot of gaps, and we filled in the gaps with modern techniques, and we keep changing those techniques to see if different ones work better or worse. There's a constant experiment. And we try to short circuit ourselves to that place of ensemble, as the French would say, of togetherness, tilsaman. The complicité, also they say in French, that sort of unspoken mutual understanding. And like we said earlier, to find the play in that too. I think it's something that everybody experiences at some point. You catch yourself walking in the same way as a friend, or you both go for the glass at the same time and you mirror each other, or it's lovely and we enjoy it and we think, oh, that was funny or that was strange. But it's actually, it's rather than coincidence. It's something, it's a muscle that can be strengthened, and it's really fun. We find ourselves slipping through crowds at commuter time because we're so used to moving through each other, moving through big groups of people. You learn to listen to body language very, very, very carefully. It can be hard to switch off when you're deep into the training. But it's about creating a safe space so that you can play freely and switch on all of your listening muscles and tune into everybody in the room as keenly as possible, and switch up that awareness to the space that you're in and how you might want to move around it, and then switch up that awareness again when the final member of the acting company arrives, as it were, and that's the audience. And then the new game is, how do you listen to them? How do you listen to a group of people that have come together to become an audience? Because, of course, that's a very dangerous group. If they're pushed in the wrong way, they become a mob. Listening to and playing with an audience and teasing them into relaxing, or helping them relax if they don't seem that they want to, is another listening task. It's all, we think, they would have been really great at listening.
I think nowadays in theater, I would say we perceive the audience as more like a passive part of the theater, right? But I think you've said before that in times of Shakespeare, it wasn't exactly like this.
Right. So big speech, Macbeth seeing the dagger float before him on his way to kill the king, says, "Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still." And he sees this dagger floating in front of him, and he tries to take hold of it, and he can't, and then he starts questioning what it is. And for a lot of the last, about 150 years ago, they turned the lights off in theatre auditoriums. The lights would have been on until that point. The candles would have been lit, emulating an indoor version, essentially. But, candlelight, you must remember, isn't like electric bulb light. Even a full room of candles can only give a very sort of opaque or diffused quality to the light. It can be quite hard to see from one side of the room to the other. But still, the actors would have been able to see the audience. And that stopped about 150 years ago, and we turned the lights off. And watching a character like Macbeth exploring the idea what this dagger is, because the actor can't see the audience, because they're now sitting in the dark, there's this kind of a fourth wall of the stage. There's apparent walls to the left and the right of the actor, and there's a wall behind them. And this sort of wall of darkness can't be broken. The actor can't see the audience can see the actor, but they can kind of, as you say, stay passive. They can do what they want. They can fall asleep and they won't be noticed. They can read, they can make out, they can eat, they can do whatever they like. And there's no one to talk to. So, of course, this is sort of also 150 years ago, around the time of Freud and introspection. And Shakespeare's speeches became about, especially when the characters by themselves on the stage, about the audience witnessing an inner monologue. And we're watching them essentially articulate their inner train of thought. The speeches work quite well that way. The thing is that 400 years ago, when Shakespeare's actors are acting outside, the daylight is on the audience and it's on the actors. They can see each other. And as an actor, then you can see if people are falling asleep or bored or enjoying themselves or picking their nose or nowadays, on their phone or what have you. And you can also make eye contact with individuals. And that's incredibly powerful as a protagonist, because it means that your speeches, you can talk to people. And that's what we've realized, that these dramatically, what these speeches act as, are an opportunity for the protagonist to ask the audience to help them to work out their problem, to go to essentially their best friend and say, I don't know what to do or what's happening here. I've never felt this way before. Ah, help me.
Would the audience reply?
Yeah, and
Really?
that's the thing. Well, you know, we've got pantomime this time of year in the UK. Is it popular over here?
We know what it is.
Right.
But,
So it's a really silly, often Christmassy kind of play.
Yeah.
Aladdin is a popular one. Cinderella is a popular one of those classic fairy tales. And usually a male actor plays the dame, like a big female character with huge makeup and stuff. And there's usually a princess, and you know, Peter Pan is another one. And there's a lot of audience interaction. There's usually a bit where the villain creeps up on the protagonist and the audience are encouraged to scream out, "He's behind you." And then the protagonist says, "Oh, no, he isn't." And then the audience goes back, "Yo, yes, he is." Yeah, everyone has a great old time. There's like these tropes of what's expected. And the hero comes on and we cheer, and the villain comes on and we boo. There's no reason to expect that kind of, the cheering for the hero and the booing for the villain wouldn't have happened in Henry V. You know, why wouldn't you cheer the king and why wouldn't you boo the French? Especially when they're being mean, right? You know, especially when the king's doing something wonderful. Especially when he's your king, right? And we hate the French. You know, there was all that going on in Shakespeare's time. But in Hamlet has a speech that begins, "What a rogue and peasant slave am I. Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so to his whole conceit, from her working all his visage waned?" And he goes on. Basically, this actor, this player that he's seen, has just given a speech about a Greek tragic female figure called Hecuba. And the player, the actor, is so good at giving that speech, he is evidently emotionally moved by it, or at least appears to be, and actually probably is. In telling the story of Hecuba, the actor has an actual emotional reaction to it that is controlled, again, maybe a bit like my experience with King Lear, but it's true, it's not forced. And Hamlet says, how can he look that way and act that way about something that is a story that doesn't mean anything to him, and yet me, I've been told by the ghost of my dead father that my father was murdered by my uncle, and I've been told I must get revenge, and I've done nothing. I've got all the reason to react, and I haven't. And he says, am I a coward, in this speech? And I always invite the actors I work with to, if they encounter a question in a speech, ask the question as if you're asking your best friend. Like, look at the audience, find someone in it, and ask them. And wait for a reply. And you know, when they did Hamlet at Shakespeare's Globe, that's exactly what the artistic director at the time who was playing Hamlet did. He came out, he had the speech, and he said, am I a coward? And he waited. And this early 21st century audience didn't know what to do, because admittedly they were standing in daylight, so they could be seen, they felt like they were being talked to, but they're in the practice of being a very good, quiet audience, not like a football crowd. That's, you know, think of Shakespeare's time perhaps more like a, you know, that engagement that you get from sports fans in stadiums. So Mark waited, and I think, and sometimes even asked the question again, and eventually someone would say, yeah, you're a coward. And the next lines are, who calls me thus, breaks my pate across, plucks off my beard and blows it in my face, gives me the lie of the throat as deep as to the lungs? Who does me this? Huh? And like literally in the script it says, who does me this, question mark, and then H-A, huh, question mark. And then the next lines are, yeah, I should take it. Yeah, you're right. So there's actually written into the script an opportunity, a space for the audience to vocally respond. So yeah, we think that they felt that they had agency. And that's the thing, you know, rather than sitting in the dark, being passive, not taking part, not being invited to take part, Shakespeare's audience was standing around the stage, so they were physically, engaged. They felt like they were being directly spoken to, because it felt like the actors were making eye contact with them all the time. And then the actors would actually talk to them, and they felt they had the permission to answer and to offer opinion, essentially. Now they're actively taking part in the telling of the story. They are helping the protagonist. That means they're more likely to laugh if the protagonist makes a joke. They're more likely to cry when the protagonist dies, if they die at the end, or fail. They leave the theatre feeling like they've added a rock to the pile of that story. They feel like they've taken part. They feel a part of it. And that's so powerful. It would have been a very different experience going to the theatre back then. And indeed, if you can get a glimpse of it, if you go to the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre on the south bank of the River Thames in London, if you're ever lucky enough to get to pass by that place, it's a very cheap £5, I think, to stand in front of the stage. And the atmosphere in there is really electric. And they haven't quite gotten their heads around how to give that permission, how to make sure that the audiences know they've got that permission. But when it works, and they do, it's quite something.
I have one last question for you.
Okay.
I mean, it's very general, but I think we've talked here a lot about like the misconceptions about Shakespeare, right? So if there's one that you feel like gets in the way of understanding Shakespeare better today, what would it be?
God, I thought you started with it.
Just pick one. I know there's a lot.
No. That's a beautiful question. I'm just buying myself some thinking time, really. But I think the answer that came straight to me is the answer I'll stick with. I think that oftentimes people think Shakespeare is difficult, that it's filled with difficult words. Now, I think Shakespeare is difficult to read. I also think that Mozart's Requiem, the score of it, is difficult to read because I am not skilled at reading music. I'm very bad at it. I'm quite good at listening by ear, playing by ear. I've got good sort of internal pitch, I suppose. But the little black dots have never really made sense to me in a way that I see them making beautiful sense. On the way here, there's one of the university buildings, I think. It's kind of built in copper outside. And there's
the library.
Right. Mm-hmm. There's a mathematical equation on there. And then next to it, there's music. And I stood, as part of the reason why I was a little bit late, I stood and looked at it and realized I was completely unable to translate what any of that meant, and knew that there are many people out there in the world, maybe perhaps not so many in the math equation, that it's harmony to, that they completely can hear the tune. And that's what Shakespeare's actors were like. They were the only people that were supposed to read these things. They're called plays, they're not called reads. So part of the reason that I think Shakespeare is felt to be difficult is because our first experiences of accessing it, we're not given a CD, we're given the score and expected to suddenly write an exam piece about it, for goodness sakes. I think that Shakespeare can feel difficult because it's written in poetry, and poetry, you need to be clever, right, for poetry. And a bit like jazz, you need to wear the right clothes and read the right books and have clever conversations about it. But actually, Shakespeare wrote his characters in poetry because it was a style of poetry that has the same rhythm as spoken English. This de-dum, 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 de-dum rhythm is exactly the same as the rhythm of modern English. I dropped my phone and cracked the screen today. I dropped my phone and cracked the screen today. He wrote in this rhythm that's got the same rhythm as spoken English. It's also got the same rhythm as your heartbeat. It's a very human sounding rhythm thereby, at least to the English. And he worked out that if he manipulated that rhythm, it would sound more, because when we speak, we stop and we start and we're non-fluent and we're arrhythmic oftentimes, especially when we're passionate. And so he would manipulate the rhythm of that poetry and it would sound even more natural. But because it's heightened, because it's poetry, people don't normally speak in poetry, and they certainly don't often speak in rhyme. So it sounds more theatrical, but it also sounds real and emotional and human. But that's really hard to perceive when you're reading it on a page and it's not being spoken by someone from the heart. And then, the first book that I did was a dictionary, and we include all the difficult words in Shakespeare. You can find, there's a website for it. It's called shakespeareswords.com. And if you're ever not sure what a word means in Shakespeare, you can look it up there for free. I mean, there is a subscription thing on it, but you can look at it for free for like 20 or something. Anyway, I'm not trying to sell it.
I'll put a link to it anyway.
Well, thank you. But when we did that dictionary of all of the difficult words in Shakespeare, we worked out that about 5% of the words in Shakespeare would cause a modern speaker of English, even second language speaker of English, a little bit of trouble. That's not bad. So I think of the misconceptions of difficulty, perhaps the biggest one might be you understand more of the words that he uses than you might think. The task, as it turns out, is less about understanding the words and more probably about understanding being courageous enough and vulnerable enough to dare to sample and taste what the emotions that those words are carrying are like. That's maybe the hardest thing. But the words, learn a language on Duolingo, right? It's all about learning vocabulary. And I think the schools where they encourage kids to learn how to speak a bit of Shakespeare, whether that's insults or whatever, and they start wishing each other good morrow and good Ian and that kind of thing, just getting some Shakespeare, getting used to those words in you can be a really gentle way into recognizing that we're speaking in modern English. Shakespeare wrote in early modern English. It hasn't changed that much. But it's getting your head around recognizing that there might be space for poetry in your life. And poetry is nothing really more than just really well-articulated, eloquent thoughts and feelings. He did it rather well.
Thank you so much. Ben Crystal was my guest, and this was a very illuminating conversation, I would say. I will admit I was entering this world of Shakespeare with a little bit of skepticism because I was also taught Shakespeare at school in a certain way, and I think I am going to go and read some Shakespeare now.
Or go and see some. Or go and listen to some.
Yes, listen. Yeah, definitely.
It was lovely talking with you too.
Thank you. This was an episode of NeoTalk, the official podcast of the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Warsaw, recorded in the Radio Campus studio. Franek Wójcicki edited this episode, and the cover art is by Weronika Rosik. Please check out our show notes if you're interested in the books and other sources mentioned in this episode. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions for topics we could cover, email us. My name is Maria Usakowska. Thanks for listening.